Prejudice is one of my favourite books, and I read it long before I got into family history. I think I was about 11 years old the first time I bought a copy of it. And when I've reread it in more recent years, I've noticed certain references that anyone who's ever investigated their family history would probably appreciate that little bit more. Just because of those subtle little details that relate to the real life resources that we use when we trace our ancestors. Now, it goes without saying that Pride and Prejudice is a novel. It is an entirely fictional story. The characters are fictitious, they did not really exist. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to treat them as though they did, as though they were actual real people. And I'm going to use some of the knowledge that I've picked up as a family historian to work out what we can infer about the characters and how they lived, where their income came from, which is a question that never seems to get addressed very much in the novels, just by using the clues that Jane Austen herself dots throughout the text. The bulk of the action in Pride and Prejudice takes place over a period of roughly 12 to 15 months. We begin somewhere before Michaelmas, which is the 29th of September in the first year, and we go all the way through to somewhere between October and Christmas that isn't exactly specified in the second year. Now, in the first half of the novel, the character Mr. Collins writes a letter which is dated Monday the 18th of November. And in the second half, we're told that Lydia Bennet comes to stay with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, on Monday the 2nd of August, prior to her wedding. So there's two really good clues there. Can we apply them to a real calendar? What is becoming quite apparent here is that the dates in the novel don't actually synchronise. You cannot make them relate to either a standard year calendar or a leap year calendar. So, just for the sake of argument, I'm going to take Mr. Collins' letter as correct, simply because it matches up with Bingley's later recollection that the ball that he hosts, which Mr. Collins does attend the following week, was on the 26th of November, which he states was a Tuesday. So for the sake of argument, let us say that the book is set between August-September 1811 and about November of 1812. This would also fit in very nicely with Elizabeth's visit to Charlotte and Mr. Collins the following spring, because she arrives there with them in Kent 3 to 4 weeks before Easter, and Darcy and his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam are said to arrive as Lady Catherine's guests at Rosings almost a full week before Easter Sunday, but not a complete week. We're then also told that Elizabeth, Maria and the Collins family see Darcy at church once before Easter Sunday. So if he hadn't arrived on the previous Sunday, which is Palm Sunday, he has obviously appeared in Kent at some time during Holy Week. So he's attending a pre-Easter service. And I have seen one suggestion that it might be the case that they actually saw him in church for the Good Friday service, which is entirely possible. When they were invited to visit Lady Catherine on the evening of Easter Sunday, Elizabeth specifically asks Darcy whether or not he's seen her sister Jane in London. Elizabeth tells him very specifically that Jane has been there For 3 months she went back with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, after the Gardiners stayed with the Bennets for Christmas. And the book again is quite precise about that. They are there for a week around Christmas, but they don't stay until New Year's Eve. So again, that's quite a tight time frame, which again would fit with an earlier Easter, which falls towards the end of March. And when you look at a real life calendar, you find that in 1808, 1810 and 1811, and also 1813, Easter fell between the 14th and 22nd of April every time in those years. It only fell on the 29th of March twice between 1800 and the novel being published in 1813, once in 1807 and once in 1812. So this again is a good indicator that maybe the book is set in the 1811-1812 period. Before the end of the first chapter of the novel, Mrs. Bennet tells her husband that their new neighbour, Mr. Bingley, will be moving to the nearby property Netherfield Park at Michaelmas. And in a family history context, that isn't all that unusual. Michaelmas, or the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels, if we're being correct about it, falls on the 29th of September, and it's one of the old quarter days, the others being Lady Day on the 25th of March, Midsummer on the 24th of June traditionally, and Christmas on the 25th of December. And it was very, very common for people to pay their rent on those days, or to take out a lease on a property, which is what Bingley has done. But there were variants. I'm going to infer from the fact that Bingley has leased Netherfield at Michaelmas on one of the quarter days, that he must be paying his rent quarterly. Whereas in 1776, my ancestor Joseph Hurst, who was an Ormskirk shoemaker, leased 11 acres on 35 perches of land from the Earl of Sefton, and the paperwork I found relating to that specifically says that Joseph was expected to pay the appropriate rent money of 5 shillings and sixpence upon the feast days of Pentecost, which is usually the end of May, sometime in June, and the feast of St. Martin the Bishop in winter. So yeah, Pentecost is 50 days after Easter. It's a variable feast, so usually May, June time. And St. Martin's Day, or Martinmas, was the 11th of November. But it looks like Mr. Bingley, if he rents at Michaelmas, prefers to pay his rent quarterly. And this is going to take us really neatly into his family background. Because where did he get his money from? Charles Bingley may only be a supporting character in Pride and Prejudice. He's a friend of the hero, Fitzwilliam Darcy, but don't overlook him, because if you read between the lines, you can infer an awful lot about Bingley's family background. Charles Bingley, we are told, doesn't inherit any property, but the death of his father leaves him with an inheritance of nearly £100,000. That's a colossal sum of money. If he's got a fortune, why has he only got an income of £4,000 or £5,000 a year? To answer that question, I think we need to consider interest rates. This is the economic side of family history. The website Measuring Worth includes facts and figures about interest rates in Britain from 1790 all the way to the present day. So as a little experiment, I had a look into those details and those percentages for the years 1800 to 1811, just to get an idea what the typical interest rates were in the Regency period. And they vary a little bit, not much, generally between 4.23% and 5.3%, neither of which I would say no to today. averaging around 4.76%. Again, very good rate compared to today, especially if you're a saver. So if we assume that Bingley has a fortune that is worth £95,000, on average he would be earning £4,522 in interest every year, which matches up nicely with what Jane Austen is telling us. Like most people, Bingley is probably skimming off that interest every year so that he's got some money to live on, while the next bit of interest builds up. So that is where his money's coming from. He's living on the interest. So where has that enormous fortune come from? Well, to remind us that Bingley's very snobby sisters think a little bit too highly of themselves and should perhaps keep their feet a bit closer to the ground, Jane Austen points out that their dowries, £20,000 apiece, and their brother's fortune have been earned because earlier generations of the family were in trade. But where it is really interesting is that there is a very vague hint that their family originally came from some unspecified part of the north of England. Bingley's father, we're told, had intended to purchase an estate, but he did not live to do so. So I'd guess that either Bingley Senior dies in his 40s or 50s, a little earlier than expected, quite possible as all of his children seem to be in their 20s. Or maybe it just took him some time to build up the fortune to the point where he was independently wealthy, and allowing his son, therefore, to become a gentleman. Bingley, we know, has two sisters. Definitely two. There may be more, but we know there are two. Louisa, the eldest, is married, and Caroline. Now we don't know their exact ages, but if we were to say that the birth order is Louisa, who is about 25, then Charles is 22, 23 at the beginning of the novel, and Caroline is somewhere around 21, that would work. Their father could have been born in 1760, so he would have been, theoretically, should have been about 51 at the start of the book. Their grandfather could have been born 30 years before that. He could have been born in 1730. Now, the north of England really prospered during the Industrial Revolution, which is sometimes defined as the period from 1750 to 60 into the 1840s. So, based on that theory, could this be a rough outline of their family tree? If we think about it, the Bingley family being from the north of England, the textile mills and the cotton factories are springing up. The goods are going between Leeds and Liverpool on a canal that is being constructed from 1770 to about 1816, with a bit of catch-up work thereafter. There are mill owners and merchants and importers of raw materials like cotton and wool. They are doing really, really well financially. They are making fortunes out of the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, if you know Yorkshire at all, you may well know that there is a place called Bingley, and it's not too far from the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. So is that a little tiny clue, if you want to see it that way, into the Bingley family origins? Is there a clue about how the family made that gigantic fortune, the one that gives Louisa and Caroline a dowry of £20,000 apiece, with the residue then able to give their brother £4,000 to £5,000, or roughly £4 to £5 million to live on every year? Maybe. And that's why I think we need to talk about Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. Caroline Bingley and Louisa Hurst are not the sort of people anybody would want as a friend. They're only too ready to mock Jane Bennet's relatives as soon as her back is turned because they think that Jane's relatives are lower class. Chapter 4 tells us, they were not deficient in good humour when they were pleased, nor in the power of making themselves agreeable when they chose it, but they were proud and conceited, in the habit of spending more than they ought and of associating with people of rank, and were therefore in every respect entitled to think well of themselves and meanly of others. Essentially, they are snobs. They're trying to gloss over the fact that their wealth is new money. A generation or two before them, their ancestors were working really, really hard to build up the fortune that they are now spending very lavishly on being fashionable. In Chapter 7, after inviting Jane to dinner, they ridicule her low social connections because her grandfather, Mr. Gardiner Senior, is implied to have been an attorney in a country town, so doing just normal day-to-day legal business. He has 2 daughters and a son, at least, and he once employed a clerk, Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips marries one of his daughters and then eventually takes over the business. Jane Austen tells us this quite specifically. Another daughter, of course, marries Mr. Bennet and has the 5 girls, lives at Longbourn. The son, meanwhile, Edward Gardiner, lives in Cheapside in London, and he is said to be in trade. He's also married to a woman who is said to be a few years younger than Mrs. Bennet, and they have 4 children. The eldest is only 8 years old, so the youngest could be maybe 2 or 3. His niece Jane actually comments that he has several children and he may have more, which is a very clear hint that Mrs. Gardiner could easily be in her mid-30s. Maybe this is what their family tree looks like. Then we move forward to chapter 25, and we find Jane Austen poking fun at the Bingley sisters' assumptions about Mr. Gardiner. She says the Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing that a man who lived by trade, and within view of his own warehouses, could have been so well-bred and agreeable. We never learn exactly what it is that Mr. Gardiner does, but warehouses is suggesting that he needs to store something. He could be a wine merchant, he could be a silk merchant, he could be a textile merchant. Now there's a possibility. Because Mrs. Gardiner is from Derbyshire, so the obvious question there is, how did they meet? Derbyshire is an area of coal mining and cotton spinning at that particular time in history. Is that how they met? Their address is not in a very smart part of London, but nevertheless, when Elizabeth breaks her journey to visit her married friend Charlotte later on in the book, the Gardiners, they have absolutely no problem at all treating her and Jane to a morning of shopping and a night out at the theatre. They have got the funds available to do something of that kind, a bit of a treat, a bit of an indulgence, not something they do every week, but something that is within their means to afford. So perhaps the funniest part of this is that if it is so that Mr. Gardiner is some kind of textile merchant, and Grandfather Bingley made his fortune in the Industrial Revolution somehow, somewhere in the north, there is more than a remote possibility that they were working in different sectors of the same industry. They could have been working in the textile industry at different periods in history. Caroline Bingley is very, very quick to enjoy her money. She's much less ready to appreciate where exactly it came from and how hard people worked for it. So what do you make of the unstated professions of Mr. Gardiner and the Bingley ancestors? Do you think there could be a textiles connection? Or have you made another deduction, or the clues in the book that I haven't spotted? I'd love to know your thoughts. And I will be looking further into family history in terms of how it relates to Pride and Prejudice in another video very, very soon.